She expired 2 million years ago. But today humanity realizes it was a mistake. The signal arrived on a Tuesday. Not with fanfare, not with the blaring alarms that Hollywood had promised for decades. It arrived at 3:17 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, encoded in a narrowband microwave frequency that the Parkes Observatory in New South Wales had been quietly monitoring since 1961. It was soft, compressed, ancient. Dr. Yael Oren was the first human being to read it, or rather, to notice that it was there at all. She was 31 years old, 2 cups of coffee deep into a graveyard shift, her hair pulled back in the kind of defeated ponytail that only exists at 3 a.m. in radio telescope control rooms. The anomaly appeared as a subtle brightness on her spectrogram, barely a whisper above background noise. She almost dismissed it. What stopped her was the regularity. Not in the robotic, mechanical sense of a pulsar. She knew pulsars. This was something else. There was variation within the pattern, the kind of layered complexity that natural phenomena almost never produce. It reminded her, in the strangest way, of breathing, of something that had once been alive using its last energy to exhale. She flagged it. Filed a report. Went back to her coffee. By Thursday, the flag had been escalated 3 times. By Saturday, the Breakthrough Listen program had confirmed it independently from 2 sites in California and 1 in South Africa. The signal was repeating on a 4.7-hour cycle, encoding what early analysis suggested was structured binary data, not random bits but organized packets with headers, separators, something resembling a table of contents. By the following Wednesday, the word extraterrestrial was no longer being avoided in the closed briefings. The source was easy enough to triangulate. It came from the direction of Kepler 442, a quiet K-type star approximately 1,194 light-years from Earth. It was not a famous star. Nobody had named a constellation after it. It sat in the catalog the way most stars do. A number, a classification, a spectral signature, and not much else. Kepler 442b had been discovered in 2015. It was considered one of the most Earth-like exoplanets ever catalogued, rocky, temperate, sitting comfortably inside the habitable zone with a similarity index to Earth of 0.84. Astronomers had noted it with interest and then moved on, because 1,194 light-years was not a distance that invited urgency. Now it invited nothing else. The global scientific response was, by human standards, reasonably calm. There were no panic announcements, no press conferences carried live on every network simultaneously. There was instead a slow, careful, deeply nervous process of verification. Every major radio telescope on Earth was redirected. The James Webb Space Telescope began targeted observation of Kepler 442's spectral profile. A dozen linguistics and information theory teams were quietly mobilized. What they found, over the next 6 weeks of painstaking analysis, was this: the signal was not being transmitted now. It was not a live broadcast. The data itself carried timestamps, or what appeared to be timestamps, once a small team at MIT cracked the encoding structure. And those timestamps indicated that the original transmission had been initiated approximately 1,200 years ago, meaning it had been sent roughly around the same time as the fall of the Tang dynasty, when most of humanity was still using hand-forged iron tools and reading by candlelight. But the signal's contents were staggering. Not because they were impossibly advanced, because they were a record, a farewell. Dr. Lina Vasquez, the computational linguist who led the decoding effort out of Geneva, later described the moment of first comprehension as the loneliest feeling I have ever had in my life. The message, once decoded across 16 months of iterative analysis, using a mathematical framework the senders had helpfully embedded at the start, as if they had anticipated needing to teach a stranger how to read their language, was not a greeting. It was not a warning. It was not a declaration of war or an offer of alliance. It was a death record. The beings who had sent it, they referred to themselves with a glyph that the translation team, for lack of a better approximation, rendered as the L, had compiled it in the full knowledge of their own extinction. The signal was structured like an archive: history, biology, cultural practice, scientific knowledge, and at the end, a final section that Vasquez's team struggled with for 4 months before they understood what they were reading. It was a testimony. A last statement. The kind left by someone who knows that once they finish speaking, the room will be empty forever. The AL had died. Every single one of them. Not violently, not suddenly, but with a kind of slow, terrible certainty. The signal documented the final 310 years of their civilization, the detection of their star's increasing luminosity, the escalating atmospheric damage, the failure of their engineering solutions one by one, and the eventual, unanimous decision that the only thing left worth doing was to tell someone. To tell anyone. The last ale, a designation in their record that translated imperfectly as the speaker, had compiled the final transmission alone, on a world that had already lost its oceans. What struck the scientific community hardest, the detail that crawled under the skin and stayed there, was not the tragedy of the extinction itself. Civilizations die. Stars evolve. The universe does not traffic in mercy. What struck them was the timing. The signal had left Kepler 442 approximately 1,200 years ago, traveling at the speed of light toward a galaxy it could not be certain was listening. But the extinction itself, the actual death of the last AL, had not happened 1,200 years ago. The timestamps inside the archive were explicit about this. The AL had maintained detailed records of elapsed time. Their civilization had begun to fail far earlier. The archive contained transmissions dated across more than 4 centuries, sent periodically, updating their situation with a kind of clinical, heartbreaking precision. The last transmission, the final entry from the speaker, was dated at what the translation team calculated, after months of astronomical and chronological cross-referencing, as approximately 2 million years before the present. 2 million years. The EL had not died while humanity was learning to write. They had not died while our species was building the first cities or sailing the first oceans. They had died before Homo sapiens existed. Before our ancestral line had fully separated from the great apes. Before the first stone hand axe had been struck from flint by a creature whose descendants would one day sit in radio telescope control rooms at 3 a.m., drinking bad coffee. 2 million years ago, on a world 1,194 light-years away, the last living member of a star-faring civilization had sat down to finish a message, and had addressed it to whoever might one day be out there. They had aimed it toward a small, unremarkable star they had observed, in their astronomical surveys, as having some potential. A G-type star. Warm. Stable. Orbited by a rocky world at a promising distance. They had aimed it at our sun. They had aimed it at us. They had died believing we might exist someday. And they had waited, not lived to wait but trusted that the signal itself would wait on their behalf, for 2 million years. The briefing room on the 4th floor of CERN's administrative complex had not been designed for the weight of what was now being discussed inside it. It was a standard institutional space, rectangular, fluorescent, furnished with a conference table that had survived 20 years of budget disputes and at least one memorable argument about string theory. A projector screen at one end. A whiteboard at the other, still faintly marked with equations from the previous week's quantum chromodynamics seminar. A coffee station that nobody had thought to refill. 14 people sat around the table. They had been chosen carefully, not for seniority, but for the specific combination of skills that this situation demanded. 2 computational linguists including Vasquez. 3 astrophysicists. A specialist in ancient human archive systems who had spent her career recovering degraded data from Bronze Age clay tablets. A cognitive scientist. 2 mathematicians. A philosopher of science who had published extensively on epistemological frameworks for non-human intelligence. And 4 observers from national space agencies who had been told, in very direct terms, that they were present to listen and not to manage. Yael Oren sat near the window. She was still not entirely sure how she had ended up in a room like this. She was a radio astronomer. She found signals. Other people figured out what they meant. But apparently the person who found the signal got to stay. Dr. Maren Holst, the astrophysicist running the meeting, pulled up the first slide. It showed a reconstruction of Kepler 442b as it had likely appeared 2 million years ago, built from spectral analysis and geological modeling. Blue oceans. Greenish-brown landmasses. A thicker atmosphere than Earth's, with a slight orange tint from the K-type star's light. Clouds streaked across the equatorial band. It looked, in the way that truly alien things sometimes do, startlingly familiar. "We need to be clear about what we know and what we are inferring," Holst said. She spoke in English, which had become the working language of the group by default. Her accent was Danish, clipped and precise. "The signal is real. The encoding is internally consistent. The mathematical framework embedded in the header checks out against every test we have applied. These are not artifacts of instrument noise or human pattern seeking. We are dealing with genuine structured information from a non-human civilization." Nobody in the room nodded. Nobody needed to. They had all accepted this already, in the private, careful way that scientists accept things, not with excitement but with the quiet, serious weight of evidence. "What we are still reconstructing," Holst continued, "is the full scope of what they sent. The archive is large. We have decoded approximately 40% of it. What I want to walk through today is the portion that affects our immediate understanding of who they were. The EL, as best as the decoding team could reconstruct, had been technological for a long time. Their archive did not begin at their equivalent of the Bronze Age. By the time they felt the need to make a comprehensive record of themselves, they had already been a spacefaring civilization for what appeared to be several thousand years. They had explored their immediate stellar neighborhood. They had established habitats beyond their home world. They had developed a scientific tradition of extraordinary rigor, the kind that accumulates across centuries of unbroken inquiry. They were not, by any measure the team could apply, primitive. They were, by any honest measure, more advanced than humanity is today. And they had still died. This was the detail that the philosopher, Dr. Andrei Bachu, pressed on hardest in the early days of the briefing cycle. He had said it in the first meeting, and he had said it again every time someone tried to bracket the existential implications in favor of technical analysis. The EL are not a cautionary tale. They are a data point. And it is a very specific data point. They knew what was happening to their star. They had centuries of warning. They were technologically sophisticated enough to send a signal that has survived 2 million years of interstellar travel intact. And they could not save themselves. You let that sit. What does that tell us about the nature of the problem they faced? The stellar evolution data embedded in the AEL archive was, from a purely scientific standpoint, extraordinary. They had maintained continuous astronomical observation of their star, Kepler 442, across more than 4 centuries of documented decline. The records showed a gradual but accelerating increase in luminosity. Their star was aging in the way all stars age, fusing heavier elements in its core, slowly brightening. For most of their history, this had been a background concern, noted and modeled but distant enough to be theoretical. Then it wasn't theoretical anymore. Their records showed the moment the calculation stopped being abstract. The average surface temperature of Kepler 442b had been rising for millennia in ways too slow to perceive directly, but the geological and atmospheric data had been accumulating quietly, faithfully. When the AEL finally ran the long-term projections through their most sophisticated climate models that the MIT team assessed as arguably more comprehensive than anything humanity currently possesses, the output was unambiguous. Their world had a window. A closing window. What followed in the archive was not panic. The EL did not appear to be a species that panicked. What followed was a systematic, multi-generational effort to solve the problem, the kind of coordinated, civilization-scale engineering response that humanity has only ever managed to approximate in the most extreme circumstances of wartime production. They tried 17 distinct approaches over the course of 200 years. The archive documented each one with exhausting thoroughness. The theory, the implementation, the results, the failure modes. Solar shielding projects. Atmospheric re-engineering. Deep underground habitats designed to survive surface temperatures that would eventually reach 80 degrees Celsius on average. Interstellar colonization programs aimed at establishing permanent populations on other worlds. That last effort, the one that should, by every model the Geneva team could construct, have worked, was documented in the most painful section of the archive. The EL had reached 2 other stellar systems. They had established outposts. They had sent population groups of thousands aboard generation ships built with the full technical knowledge of their civilization. And those outposts had failed. Not immediately. Not violently. The archive documented it with the flat, careful tone of people who have accepted a truth they desperately did not want to accept. Each outpost had faced its own catastrophic problem. A pathogen the new ecosystem produced that their immune systems could not handle, a geological instability in a new world that their surveys had missed, a slow failure of closed-loop life support systems across decades of operation. The EL had not been destroyed by one catastrophe. They had been worn down by many, chipped away by the compounding cruelty of a universe that offers no guarantees. Their last generation ship had gone silent 47 years before the final transmission. Yal Oren asked the question that nobody else had managed to ask directly. The section at the end, she said during the 3rd day of briefings. The part addressed to whoever finds this. Have we decoded it? Vasquez looked at her. There was something in the linguist's expression that Yael had not seen in the weeks of working together. Not uncertainty, but a kind of careful restraint, as if she was choosing how to begin. Yes, Vasquez said. We have decoded it. She pulled up the text on the projector screen. It had been translated with every tool the team possessed, cross-checked against the mathematical and structural patterns established throughout the rest of the archive, revised 17 times. It was 9 sentences long. The room read it in silence. Nobody spoke for almost 3 minutes. Then Bachu very quietly said, "They knew we would make a mistake." The 9 sentences occupied 3 lines on the projector screen, rendered in plain white text against a dark blue background. Someone had chosen the font carefully, clean, readable, free of any flourish that might introduce interpretive ambiguity. Below each sentence was a confidence percentage from the translation algorithm, ranging from 81% to 97%. Dr. Vasquez read them aloud. She had agreed to do this once at the beginning of the full team meeting and then not again. Reading them once, she had decided, was enough for anyone. 1. We observed your star before the end. It is healthy. You have time that we did not. 2. You will find this record at a moment in your development that we calculated with what precision we could manage from this distance. 3. If our estimate is correct, you are young. Younger than we were when we first understood what was coming. 4. We do not write to mourn ourselves. We write because the error we made is not inevitable. 5. The error is not technological. We had sufficient technology. The error is organizational. 6. When the survival of everything requires the coordination of everything, the systems built for ordinary times will fail you. 7. We learned this too late. Our institutions were designed to manage competing interests, not to dissolve them. 8. You will face the same pressure from your star in your own time. The physics do not negotiate. 9. Build differently than we did while you still have the luxury of doing so in peace. The silence that followed was different from the silence after the first reading. That silence had been shock. This silence was something else. The particular quality of quiet that settles over a room full of intelligent people who have simultaneously understood something they cannot ununderstand. Dr. Holst was the first to speak. The 4th sentence, she said. The error is not technological. She stopped, pressed her fingers together on the table. They had generation ships. They had reached other star systems. And they're telling us that's not what failed them. They're telling us their governments failed them, Bachu said. He did not say it bitterly. He said it the way a pathologist names a cause of death, with clinical precision and no satisfaction in being right. That's one interpretation, said one of the agency observers, a NASA administrator named Kwame Asante who had, until this week, spent most of his career managing launch schedules. The translation confidence on sentence 7 is 83%. That's not negligible uncertainty. The confidence interval is on the word we're rendering as interests, Vasquez said. The underlying concept is clearer than the specific vocabulary. Their word implies competing claims on resources and authority. The sentence is describing systems, political, bureaucratic, institutional, that were built to mediate between factions rather than to act as a unified body. She paused. I'm comfortable saying they're describing something functionally equivalent to what we would call geopolitical fragmentation. So they're saying they couldn't get their governments to cooperate, Asante said. They're saying their governments were structurally incapable of cooperating at the scale required, Bachu corrected. There's a difference. One implies failure of will. The other implies failure of architecture. The days that followed the full decoding of the 9 sentences were among the most carefully managed in the history of scientific disclosure. The 14 people in that briefing room were not naive about what they were handling. They were scientists, but they were also citizens of a world that had, in recent memory, demonstrated a remarkable capacity for dismantling institutional trust, for fracturing along every available ideological line, for consuming complexity and converting it into simplified conflict. They were very aware that what they were about to release to the world was not simply evidence of alien intelligence. It was a 2-million-year-old political warning from a dead civilization addressed, with striking specificity, to their own. Holst convened a smaller group, 4 people including Oren and Vasquez, to draft the initial public communication framework. They worked in a CERN conference room over 3 days, writing and discarding and rewriting, trying to find language that was honest without being so blunt that it detonated rather than illuminated. The problem was not that the message was complicated. The problem was that it was devastatingly simple. You will face the same thing we faced. Your technology will not save you if your institutions are not capable of unified action. Build those institutions now while you have time. Yael Oren, who was not a political scientist or a policy architect or a linguist, found herself contributing to these drafting sessions in ways she had not expected. She had a habit, developed across years of searching for signals and noise, of asking the most basic possible question at the moment when everyone else was building upward in complexity. She asked it now. What exactly is the mistake they're warning us about? She said during the second night of drafting. It was past midnight. The coffee station had been restocked twice. Outside the window, Geneva was quiet and dark and indifferent. Vasquez looked at her. The organizational failure. We just spent 6 hours discussing. No, Yael said. Specifically. Which mistake? They had 16 failed mitigation attempts before they got to the generation ships. They documented all of them. And the generation ships failed too, but for different reasons. So when they say the error, are they talking about a single decisive mistake, or are they describing a pattern? The room was quiet for a moment. Bachu picked up his pen. Put it down. Picked it up again. That is, he said slowly, a very good question. It took another 3 weeks to find the answer, buried in the 60% of the archive they had not yet fully decoded. The team had been working through the material sequentially, but the section that addressed Yael's question was not in the chronological narrative portion of the archive. It was in a supplementary section that the translation algorithm had initially flagged as lower priority, a kind of appendix filled with what appeared to be analytical retrospectives written by the AEL in their final years. When the team decoded it, they found something extraordinary. The AEL had done something that no extinct civilization had ever, to human knowledge, done before. In their last decades, knowing they were dying, they had conducted a comprehensive post-mortem of their own failure. Not a historical account. Not a lament. A rigorous, systematic analysis, produced by their finest minds with the explicit purpose of transmitting not just what had happened but why, in enough detail that whoever received it might actually be able to use the information. The specific mistake, the one the 9-sentence message had called the error, was identified with painful clarity. The EL had possessed, approximately 180 years before the final transmission, a viable solution. Not a perfect solution. Not a complete solution. But a workable, technically sound approach to the atmospheric reengineering problem that, had it been implemented at civilization scale within the following 2 decades, would have extended the habitability of their world by another 4 to 5 centuries. Long enough, their models suggested, to have made interstellar colonization viable with a much larger population and resource base. The solution had been developed. It had been tested. It had been validated. And it had never been implemented. Because it required the complete subordination of every independent national and corporate interest on their world to a single coordinating authority for a sustained period of not less than 40 years. And their civilization, brilliant, ancient, technically sophisticated, had never successfully built an institution capable of doing that. Every attempt had fractured. Every coalition had collapsed. Every time the immediate cost to specific groups outweighed the abstract future benefit to everyone, the coalition had fallen apart. They had died not because they lacked the knowledge or the technology. They had died because they could not make a decision and hold to it together. Yael sat with this for a long time. 2 million years ago, a civilization older and more advanced than humanity had looked at a problem, identified the solution, and then been unable to implement it because their political architecture was not built for decisions at that scale. She thought about every international climate summit she had ever seen covered in the news. About every treaty that had collapsed into amendment cycles. About every time the abstract future had been traded for the concrete present. The EL had not failed because they were weak or foolish. They had failed because they were, in the way that matters most, recognizably like us. And they had aimed their last words directly at us because they had looked at our sun, run their models, and calculated with quiet precision that we would face the same moment they had faced. Not now. But eventually. And they had wanted us to know that the moment was coming long before it arrived. The public announcement came on a Thursday, 22 months after Yael Oren's 3 a.m. shift at Parkes Observatory. The United Nations Secretary-General delivered it live from New York, flanked by the Directors General of ESA, NASA, ISRO, CNSA, and Roscosmos, an arrangement that had required more diplomatic machinery to produce than the announcement itself. The statement was 1,400 words. It had been reviewed by 34 governments, edited by committee, negotiated over in ways that struck everyone involved as both entirely necessary and faintly absurd given its subject matter. It was, in substance, honest, which was itself a minor miracle. It said that humanity had received a confirmed signal from an extraterrestrial civilization. That the civilization was extinct. That the signal contained an archive of their history, science, and culture, and a specific message directed at whoever might receive it. That the message included both information and a warning. It did not, in its first version, quote the 9 sentences directly. This had been an agonizing decision. The argument against direct quotation was that sentence 7, the one about institutional failure, would land in a world already fracturing along fault lines of national sovereignty and institutional distrust, and would be interpreted not as a universal warning but as a political weapon wielded by whichever faction found it most convenient. The argument for direct quotation was that the AEL had aimed this message at humanity across 2 million years of silence and deserved to have it received without editorial softening. The 9 sentences were released publicly 18 days after the initial announcement, with a full scientific briefing document and an open-access repository of the decoded archive material. The decision had been Holst's, ultimately, made after 3 weeks of watching the softer version of the announcement get digested, diluted, and repurposed into exactly the kind of competing narratives that Sentence 7 had warned about. "They said it for a reason," she told the Oversight Committee. "We don't get to improve on it." The global reaction was not what the doomsday scenarios had predicted, and not what the utopian scenarios had hoped for. It was something more characteristically human than either. Complicated, contradictory, slow to form, and ultimately more substantive than its noise suggested. In the first weeks, the internet produced what the internet produces. Every conspiracy theory, every political appropriation, every cynical dismissal, every overwrought spiritual interpretation. Talk show panels argued about translation accuracy. Several governments released statements questioning the authenticity of the signal. A prominent technology billionaire called it a manufactured crisis. A religious revival movement in 3 countries declared the EL to be angels. None of this was surprising. All of it was, in its own way, evidence of exactly the dynamic the EL had described. But underneath the noise, something else was happening. It was happening in universities, in engineering departments, in policy institutes and think tanks and the quiet offices of international civil servants who had spent their careers trying to make large organizations do coherent things. It was happening in the specific community of people who had dedicated their professional lives to problems that required global coordination. Climate scientists, pandemic preparedness specialists, nuclear arms negotiators, international development economists. These were people who already understood, from lived experience, what the AEL were describing. They had been working inside those institutional constraints for decades. They had the scars of coalition collapse and treaty erosion and perpetually deferred commitments. And now they had something they had never had before, a data point. An independent, external, 2-million-year-old data point confirming that this specific failure mode was not a quirk of human political culture. It was a structural problem. It was the kind of problem that could kill a civilization. They began talking to each other differently. The academic literature that emerged in the 18 months following the announcement was unlike anything in modern scholarly history. Not in volume. The volume was extraordinary, but volume alone means nothing. What was different was the convergence. Political scientists published alongside astrophysicists. Institutional economists collaborated with cognitive scientists. Historians of the Roman Empire's administrative collapse found themselves in correspondence with specialists in the AEL archive's governmental records. Legal scholars working on international treaty enforcement mechanisms published papers alongside engineers who designed long-duration life support systems. They were all circling the same problem from different angles. What does an institution capable of sustaining 40-year civilizational commitments actually look like, and how do you build one? The AEL archive was, in this context, not just a tragedy. It was a dataset. And it was an extraordinarily useful dataset, because it documented not just the failure but the 17 failed attempts that preceded it. Each one a case study in how a specific design flaw in a specific type of coordinating institution led to a specific type of collapse. Failure mode 1. Too centralized, collapsed when the center lost legitimacy. Failure mode 6. Insufficient enforcement mechanism for defectors. Failure mode 11. Decision horizon too short to account for intergenerational cost distribution. Failure mode 14. Inadequate feedback loop between technical assessment and policy implementation. And so on. 17 distinct architectures, all tried, all failed, all documented with the meticulous care of a civilization that knew it was leaving the record for someone else to learn from. Dr. Vasquez, in an interview that was later quoted more than any other statement from any member of the decoding team, put it this way: what the AEL gave us is not a solution. They explicitly say in the archive that they do not know the solution. If they had known it, they would have implemented it. What they gave us is the most comprehensive failure analysis ever produced of the specific problem we are going to face. That is not nothing. That is actually an extraordinary gift. No engineering team would refuse a detailed record of 17 failed approaches before beginning their own design process. The AEL are telling us, here are the 17 things that don't work. Start there. What she did not say in the interview but said privately to Yael Oren several weeks later, was the other thing she had taken from the archive. They were afraid, she said. They were sitting outside on the steps of the CERN main building in the early April cold. Not of dying. They had accepted that. They were afraid that nobody would receive this. That they would spend their last energy compiling this record and aim it at a star with a promising little planet, and the planet would be empty. Or populated by something that couldn't decode it. Or something that decoded it and didn't care. She paused. The last entries in the speaker's log, the very last ones in the final months, keep returning to this. This fear that the message was going nowhere. That the hope was irrational. That a civilization that couldn't save itself certainly had no basis for trusting that some other species on some other world would receive their warning and act on it. Yael said nothing. And then they sent it anyway, Vasquez said. They calculated the probabilities, concluded that hope was statistically unjustified and sent it anyway. Because the alternative, silence, was worse. The Geneva Accord on Long-Duration Institutional Frameworks, a deliberately technical name chosen by its architects to avoid the kind of political lightning rod branding that had killed a dozen previous treaties, was signed 4 years and 3 months after the first public announcement. It was not a perfect document. It was not even a particularly elegant one. It had 17 signatory nations on its first day and 83 within the following year, and its enforcement mechanisms were still being argued over by legal scholars who could not agree on exactly how binding it was. But it established for the first time in human history, a standing institutional framework with an explicit design mandate, to maintain coordinated action on civilizational scale risks across a minimum planning horizon of 50 years, with structural protections against the specific failure modes the AEL archive had documented. It was not the solution. Its architects were very clear about this. It was an attempt to build differently, while they still had the luxury of doing so in peace. The final section of the AEL archive had been labeled in the decoding team's working taxonomy as Section 7C, Personal Narrative, Single Author. This categorization was accurate and also completely inadequate. What it contained was a journal. 112 entries, spanning the final 14 months of the speaker's life on a world that was, by then, largely uninhabitable. The entries were not written for the archive, or rather they had not originally been written as formal transmissions. The decoding team recognized this relatively early, because the style was different. Looser, more fragmented, occasionally contradictory in small ways that the rest of the archive, with its careful editorial consistency, was not. These were private writings that the speaker had chosen, at some point near the end, to append to the formal transmission. The decision to include them, personal, raw, occasionally uncertain, told the team something important about the speaker. They had understood that data was not the same as testimony. That facts about a civilization were not the same as the experience of being the last member of one. They had wanted whoever found this to know what it felt like. The speaker's identity within AEL naming conventions was complex, and the team eventually settled on simply using the term the speaker rather than attempting a transliteration that would have been technically accurate and humanly meaningless. What could be inferred from the journal's self-references was this: the speaker was old by AEL standards. A scientist by training and practice. Had spent the largest portion of their career on the archive project. Not as its initiator but as one of many contributors who had eventually become its sole remaining editor as their colleagues died, emigrated to the failed outposts, or simply stopped responding. The speaker had been alone on Kepler 442b for the last 23 months of their life. Not entirely alone. The entries made reference to automated systems still functioning, still maintaining minimal life support in the underground facility where the speaker worked. But alone in the way that matters. Without another living member of their species anywhere within communication range. The nearest AL outpost had gone silent 11 months before the journal began. Entry 7 of the journal, translated at 88% confidence, read, "I have adjusted the transmission power again. The calculations confirm that the signal will reach the target star's habitable zone in approximately 1,190 of my years. By any reasonable estimate, whatever lives there, if anything does, will receive this in a developmental window that should allow comprehension. I remind myself of this when the work feels abstract. Today the Eastern Water Reclamation System failed again. I have repaired it 3 times this month. The components were not designed for single-operator maintenance. I am managing." Entry 19. I think often about the 14th mitigation attempt. I was young when it was approved, still in my early research career. I remember the announcement being celebrated. I remember genuinely believing it would work. The design was sound. The physics were correct. The scale was the problem, always the scale. Our institutions were built by individuals, for individuals, to manage relationships between groups of individuals. They were not built for problems that require the whole to act as one body for longer than any individual's lifetime. We had never faced a problem like that before. Not really. Not one that could not be solved region by region, negotiated piece by piece, addressed in increments small enough that competing interests could be accommodated. The dying of a son does not accommodate competing interests. Entry 31. I have been thinking about what it would mean for someone to receive this and understand it and still not act. I have been thinking about this more than is probably healthy. The argument I keep constructing against my will is this. Every species that reaches the technological level required to receive this signal has already survived long enough to have developed political architecture of some complexity. And political architecture of complexity resists redesign. The incentives against structural change are enormous and immediate. The incentives for it are abstract and distant. If I were building a species from scratch, I would build one that felt the future as vividly as the present. One that could hold a threat 200 years away with the same clarity as a threat standing in the same room. But I was not built that way. And whatever is out there, they probably weren't either. And yet I keep transmitting. Entry 58 was the one that broke the decoding team's professional composure the most completely. Vasquez had been the one to read the translation aloud in the Geneva lab, and she had stopped twice before finishing it, not from technical difficulty but from the simple fact of the words. I have begun to talk to the signal. Not in any technical sense. I do not mean that I am inserting my voice into the transmission, which would require modifications I am no longer capable of making to the equipment. I mean that I talk to the direction of it. In the evening, when the work is done, I face toward the star the signal is aimed at, and I speak. I tell it about what the world looked like when I was young. I tell it about my colleagues who built this archive with me over 3 decades. I tell it about the sound of water, which I have not heard in 8 months, and about the way the light used to look through the upper atmosphere at sunrise, orange and diffuse, before the particulate levels made it wrong. I know that whatever receives this will not know my name. They will know the L only as we chose to represent ourselves in the formal record, accurate and complete and rather cold in the way that institutional documents always are. So I talk to the signal. I tell it the things the archive doesn't say. Not because it can hear me but because it matters to me that someone is trying to hear. I think that is a thing that matters even when it cannot be verified. Entry 89, written approximately 6 weeks before the final entry. I have finished the last verification pass on the transmission. The signal is stable. The power systems will maintain broadcast for another 40 years after my death, long enough to ensure multiple complete cycles are received. I am satisfied with the technical outcome. What I cannot verify is the rest. I cannot verify that someone is there. I cannot verify that they are capable of receiving it. I cannot verify that they will act on it if they do. I have been a scientist for my entire adult life. Uncertainty has never frightened me. Uncertainty is the water I swim in. I have spent decades working with data that was incomplete, inferences that might be wrong, models that approximated rather than described. But this is a different kind of uncertainty. This is the uncertainty of a message in a bottle thrown into a sea whose shores you will never see. I have decided that it doesn't matter. I mean this technically, not emotionally. The expected value calculation is straightforward. If nobody receives this, I have lost nothing except the energy spent on transmission, which I had nothing better to do with. If someone receives this and it helps them, the value is incalculable. The asymmetry is so extreme that the uncertainty becomes irrelevant. Send the signal. This is the correct answer. I keep having to remind myself of this at night. Entry 112. The last one. Translated at 94% confidence. I'm done today. The archive is complete. The final transmission header has been updated. I am in good health, which feels like a minor absurdity given everything, but it is true. The systems are maintaining. I'm not in pain. I want to say something final and I do not know what it should be. If you are reading this, you are alive. This is not a small thing. Being alive is an ongoing argument against the universe's indifference, and you are winning it, at least today. We lost our argument eventually. All arguments end. But we had it for a very long time, and we built things that were genuinely beautiful, and we understood the sky more completely than we understood ourselves, which seems to be the common condition of thinking creatures everywhere. You will face what we faced. Maybe not in your lifetimes, but in your children's or their children's. The physics are patient. We wanted you to know. We wanted you to have the time we didn't have. Use it. 7 years after the Geneva Accord was signed, A woman named Dr. Sujin Park stood at the front of a seminar room at Seoul National University and told 43 graduate students that they were going to spend the next 2 years doing the hardest thing anyone had asked a group of researchers to do in living memory. They were going to design a functioning institutional framework that could survive failure mode 14. Failure mode 14, in the working taxonomy derived from the AEL archive, was the one the team at CERN had informally called the telescope problem. It referred to the dynamic in which the technical understanding of a problem and the political mechanism for responding to it existed in separate systems with insufficient connection between them, producing a situation where the people who understood what needed to be done lacked the authority to ensure it was done, and the people with authority lacked the technical fluency to make good decisions. The AEL archive documented this failure mode in 2 of their 17 mitigation attempts. In both cases, the collapse point was the same. A technical community that could model the problem with extraordinary precision had been required to transmit its conclusions through political intermediaries who could not fully evaluate what they were hearing, and who therefore defaulted to what political systems always default to when faced with expensive, disruptive action: delay, negotiation of scope, and eventual deferral to the next governing cycle. Park had been studying this specific failure mode for 4 years. She had cross-referenced it with analogous cases in human history: the pre-2008 financial crisis period, the early COVID-19 response failures, the 30-year gap between the scientific consensus on atmospheric carbon and binding international commitments. The pattern was consistent and depressing. But the AEL archive offered something no human case study could: an external perspective on the problem from a civilization that had tried to solve it 16 times before this particular failure mode destroyed them. And buried in the retrospective analysis, in a section that had taken the Geneva team 9 months to decode and another year to interpret correctly, was something that looked very much like a partial solution. Not a complete one. The AEL were explicit that they never found a complete one. But a directional one. The insight was, once articulated, almost insultingly simple. Which is often how genuine insights present themselves. The AEL had consistently failed when the coordinating institution was built on top of existing power structures, layered over national governments, corporate interests, regional alliances, because those structures always retained the ability to defect, and they always eventually used it. The coordination sat on a foundation that was not designed to hold it. What the AEL had never successfully built, what their archive identified as the theoretically correct approach that they had never managed to implement before running out of time, was an institution with primary jurisdiction over the specific class of problem rather than derived authority from existing powers. The distinction was not semantic. In practice, it meant the difference between an institution that could be overruled and one that structurally could not because it had removed agency from member states, but because the specific domain of its authority was recognized as outside the scope of national interest from the beginning. The way, in human terms, that nobody seriously argues that individual nations should have independent control of nuclear weapon launch decisions once the missiles are already in the air. The design challenge was enormous. The political challenge was larger. But for the first time in the effort there was a direction. Park's group at Seoul National University was one of 17 research teams working on what had come to be called the AEL framework problem across 12 countries. They were not coordinating with each other directly. The methodological diversity was considered a feature, not a bug. The goal was to generate multiple competing designs that could be evaluated against each other and against the AEL's documented failure modes. In the 3rd year, 2 of the 17 teams independently converged on the same core design element. Park's team was one of them. The element was not a new institution in the traditional sense, not another treaty body with a secretariat in a European capital and a budget negotiated annually by member states who resented every dollar spent on anything that didn't deliver visible domestic benefit. It was a different structural premise entirely, built around a concept Park had taken from an unexpected source: the study of long-lived biological immune systems. The immune system, she had argued in the paper that made her reputation, is the most sophisticated known example of a distributed coordinating mechanism that sustains unified response to threats across a time horizon longer than any individual cell's lifetime, without a central command node, and with built-in resistance to co-optation by the individual components it serves. It does not negotiate with infections. It does not require member consensus before responding. It was not designed. It evolved, under severe pressure, over hundreds of millions of years into something that works. We cannot evolve our institutions, she had written. We do not have hundreds of millions of years. We have to do deliberately what biology did accidentally. And we have to do it in the next several decades. The seminar room was quiet when she finished describing this to the 43 students. Outside, it was raining, a flat sole winter rain, the kind that makes the city look very old and very patient. One of the students, a young man in the back who had not spoken yet, raised his hand. If the AL understood this, he said, why didn't they build it? Park had been waiting for this question. She had asked it herself many times during 4 years of working on the problem. Because understanding the correct design and having the political conditions necessary to implement it are different things, she said. The AEL identified the primary jurisdiction concept in their 94th year of the crisis. By that point, the political climate on their world was, according to their own records, too fractured to accept any institution that required surrendering a significant domain of authority. The parties that would need to transfer authority were the parties that were already in conflict over resources and survival. You don't get to redesign your power structures in the middle of a fight about who gets what remains. She paused. Sentence 9, she said. Build differently than we did while you still have the luxury of doing so in peace. The student nodded slowly. We still have that luxury, Park said. For now. That is why this matters now, not later. The Framework Convention on Long-Duration Civilizational Risk, the document that would eventually be called the AEL Convention in popular usage, over the strenuous objection of its drafters who found the name historically imprecise, was not born in a UN chamber. It was not announced at a world summit. It was drafted over 4 years by a working group of legal scholars, institutional designers, scientists, and former heads of state who had agreed, collectively, to do their work entirely outside the media attention that had consumed so much of the public discourse around the AEL discovery. When it was released, it was 847 pages long. It was not easy reading. Its journalist summary, widely circulated, described it as a constitution for decisions that no nation can make alone. 81 countries signed in the first year. The holdouts were significant. But the signatories represented 71% of global economic output and 68% of global population, and the framework's architects had designed it explicitly to function under those conditions, to provide enough coordination among participants to make defection progressively costly for non-participants, without requiring unanimous adoption to be useful. It was not the solution. But it was, for the first time, a structure that might hold long enough for a solution to be found. On the 31st anniversary of the signal's detection, Yael Oren returned to Park's observatory. She was 62 now. Her hair was fully gray and she had stopped apologizing for it several years ago. She still worked, not on graveyard shifts anymore, but as the director of a research institute in Sydney dedicated to the ongoing analysis of the AEL archive, which remained, after 3 decades, only 73% decoded. Some sections used linguistic constructs for which no adequate translation framework had yet been built. Some would likely remain imperfectly understood for another generation of scholars. She had made peace with this. Incompleteness was not failure. The AEL themselves had said as much, somewhere in the archive's reflective appendices. A record need not be perfect to be useful. It need only be honest. The observatory grounds were quiet in the early morning. The great dish, 64 meters across, white against a pale blue sky, was pointing at something else now, some other target in some other part of the survey. The universe had not stopped offering questions just because humanity had received the most consequential answer in its history. She stood on the grass outside the visitor center for a long time, looking at the dish. Then she walked into the control room, where a young woman she didn't recognize was sitting at the monitoring station, 2 cups of coffee on the desk beside her. The young woman looked up, startled. Then recognized her. Straightened slightly. Dr. Oren. We weren't expecting you until... I came early, Yael said. Couldn't sleep. The young woman, her badge said Priya Nair, Research Associate, nodded in the understanding way of someone who has also experienced 3 a.m. in a radio telescope control room. I'm just running the standard survey, Nair said. Nothing unusual in the last 6 hours. Good, Yael said and meant it. Unusual things at Parks had a way of changing everything. She sat down in the chair beside the monitoring station, not her chair anymore, hadn't been for years, and looked at the spectrogram display. The quiet hiss of background radiation. The occasional spike of a known source. The universe going about its business. She thought, as she had thought many times over 31 years, about the speaker. She thought about entry 112. If you are reading this, you are alive. This is not a small thing. She thought about what it meant to transmit a message into a silence you could not be certain anyone was listening to. To aim your last energy not at survival, survival being no longer possible, but at communication. At the faint, irrational, statistically unjustified hope that the record would reach someone. In the 31 years since the detection, human civilization had done what human civilizations always do: moved forward in partial, contradictory, maddening, inconsistent increments. The Geneva Accord had been signed and partially violated and renegotiated. The AEL Convention had 101 signatories and 17 prominent holdouts and a legal status that was still being litigated in 3 international courts. The research effort on long-duration institutional design had produced remarkable theoretical work and several deeply promising pilot programs and at least as many failures as successes. The sun was still stable. The physics were still patient. The window was still open. The question that Yael had carried for 31 years, the one she had never been able to fully answer, was not a scientific question. It was not a political question or a policy question or an institutional design question. It was a simpler one. Did we deserve this? Yael had not known us, had never met us, had aimed their signal at a star because the math suggested something might live there, not because they had any evidence of our existence, our intelligence, our capacity for comprehension or action. They had made a calculation based on probability, decided the hope was worth more than the silence, and spent their civilization's last resources on a message we were not guaranteed to be able to receive. They had done this in the full knowledge that they were dying, that the world they loved was becoming uninhabitable, that every institution they had built and every effort they had made had not been enough. And they had thought of us anyway. Had thought, perhaps someone else, perhaps someone later, perhaps the thing we could not do can still be done, and perhaps this record will help them do it. Did we deserve that? Yael had asked herself this for 31 years. She had eventually arrived at the only answer that felt both honest and useful. That is the wrong question. The right question was not whether they had made a reasonable calculation about our worthiness, or whether we had earned the gift of their warning by some prior act. The right question was what we did with it, what we made of the time they had imagined for us, whether the window they saw, 2 million years before we were born, would still be open when our own children's children needed to climb through it. That was the thing we owed them. Not gratitude which they could not receive. Not reverence which meant nothing to the dead. What we owed them was the outcome. The attempt. The willingness to look at the 17 failure modes they had documented and try to find an 18th path. Priya Nair had gone quiet beside her, doing her work with the focused attention of someone who takes radio astronomy seriously. Yael watched the spectrogram. "Can I ask you something?" Nair said after a while. "Yes. Do you think it'll work? The convention, the frameworks, all of it." She paused. "I'm writing a dissertation on institutional resilience and I keep running into the same problem. The theoretical designs are getting better, but we still don't have proof of concept. We've never actually had to use any of them for real." Yael was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "We haven't, and I can't tell you it will work. Nobody can tell you that." Nair nodded, looking slightly deflated. "What I can tell you," Yael said, "is that they'll never had a working model to reference either. They were designing in the dark, under active crisis, against time pressure that made rational deliberation nearly impossible. They failed. But they also compiled the most comprehensive account of their failure that they could manage, and they sent it to us and we received it." She looked at the dish through the window, white and enormous and patient. "We have something they never had. We have their record. We have the map of how not to go. We have 40 years of institutional research informed by the specific failure modes of a civilization that tried for 2 centuries before we even existed." She paused. "That is not nothing. That is not a guarantee. But it is something that no species before us has ever had." She looked at Nair. "Build anyway," she said. "While it's still peaceful. That's the whole message. Build anyway." 3 weeks later, the decoding team in Geneva announced a breakthrough in Section 9F, the portion of the AEL archive that had resisted translation longest. The new AI-assisted linguistic framework cracked a structural ambiguity that had blocked progress for 6 years. Section 9F turned out to be the AEL's own scientific archive, their version of what humanity might call a library of physics and mathematics, covering the full scope of their theoretical understanding at the time of the archive's compilation. It was, by preliminary assessment, several centuries beyond humanity's current scientific development. The news reached Yael Oren on a Tuesday morning in her office in Sydney, where she was reviewing budget applications and drinking coffee from a mug that said Parkes Radio Telescope in faded blue letters. She put the mug down. She read the message twice. Then she sat back in her chair, looked at the ceiling and laughed, not giddily, not with relief, but with the deep, genuine amusement of someone who has just received confirmation of something they suspected but had not dared to say aloud. The speaker had known. had understood, with the precise and unsentimental clarity of a scientist who had spent their life working with probability, that the formal archive, the history, the biology, the failure modes, the 9-sentence warning, was the hook. The thing that would make the signal comprehensible and urgent and impossible to dismiss. But the scientific archive was the gift. The real gift. The one that could only be given to a species that had already demonstrated it was trying. 2 million years ago, the last of the L had sat alone on a dying world and finished the work. Had compiled everything. Not just the warning. Everything. And had trusted, without evidence, that someone would be worth giving it to. Yael set down the report. Picked up her coffee. Looked out the window at Sydney's blue, indifferent sky. Build anyway, she thought. We're trying.